I wanted to tell you about some of the upcoming programs that we've got already scheduled. In May, we have a joint meeting with the San Francisco chapter, and it's halfway between here and there, so, and right close to a BART station, so everybody should be able to easily get there. In June, we've got the annual conference in San Diego, and Phil is interested in doing a conference download, which will probably be a luncheonar, which is what I'm calling the 12 to 1 time. In July, we're hoping to get some of the neighborhood dinners going again, or it doesn't have to be dinner. If you are a morning person and you prefer breakfast, let me know. My email address is kind of funky, but you can find me on the SLA website. My email is it's California Curly Top, CACURLYTOP@mac.com. And then in August, we're doing a predatory publishers session at Gilead, which is going to be in person and webinar. So look forward to that, and we're already doing the programming for the fall. So it's going to be a full menu this year. And this is my It Takes a Village speech, because it really does. Patricia Parsons, who isn't here, suggested that Marty come and speak with us. Helen Josephine found us a location, handled the registration, brought some of the equipment. Kathleen, who's our treasurer, took care of arranging for the rental of the revenue of the venue. And Phil, who's our chapter president, is our fearless leader and videographer. And Phil actually has a great announcement.
Some of you may have seen the announcement, but we just were notified that we won the IT division award for best chapter program, just best technology chapter programming for 2012-2013.
Wow.
So we'll be receiving that award at the SLA conference, and part of it is a monetary award that will allow us to do some additional technology programming. So this is the first outcome of it. We purchased in advance a second video camera so that we could have a 2-camera setup and improve our YouTube channel, which is one of the components of it. Now that we've gotten this award, we have to step up our game.
So why did the chapter get the award?
Let's see, what did it was 2 parts. One is programming on technology topics, and the second one was the use of technology in presenting programs, which wasn't one of their criteria, but it turns out they counted that anyway.
Excellent, thank you.
We're so special, that's what
So it's my great pleasure to introduce Marti Heyman, who is out here from the Detroit area. She comes out every now and then, and she was kind enough to come and talk to us on one of her trips out. She is currently the executive director at Cengage Learning, where she manages the metadata standards and services. And what's interesting about Cengage Learning is they serve both the library and the academic markets. They kind of provide that bridge. And what they're trying to do is provide integrated services to the classroom. Marty is also an adjunct from Drexel. She has an MBA and an MLS, and the MLS is from Drexel, so I don't think they let you go. You just couldn't release. In previous lifetimes, she's been a director of knowledge management strategy at Oracle. She's been the director of global knowledge management at Deloitte and the global director of taxonomy delivery services at Dow Jones. She has been a speaker at the Taxonomy Boot Camp, which we were just talking about, at SLA, and at the Information and Knowledge Management Society of Singapore. She is going to take us through a really good look at how sometimes to really achieve your business goals, you need to modify all those great standards that we try and put in place. Because once you go to apply them, life is really different. So Marty, please.
Now I can show my lack of technical skills. Sounds right. So thank you. I appreciate this opportunity to come, and I'm actually glad that we have a fairly small group and can have much more interaction than we might normally have. So, should be good. Although I reserve the right to be a consultant and just say to hard questions, well, it depends. Waffle my way out of a real answer. Okay, so when Jeannie reached out to me and said, so we had Margie Lava at the San Francisco chapter in March, and she kind of did a Taxonomy 101. We'd like to do a sort of a follow-on. Some of our members may have been at that meeting as well as just have basic understanding. So I threw out a couple ideas, and Jeannie chose this one. I think it's a great one. But after I sent her the title and the little blurb descriptor, I went, that's really not a title that's going to draw people in. Like, well, taxonomies, old, boring, and who cares about taxidermy anyway? And then the real world, none of us like the real world, right? So I went, So I thought about, for next time, right? It's always about learning and not making the same mistake again. But I could have said True Confessions of a Real Taxonomist. That's really not quite me. More me about Tales from the Crypt, a real art buff. That may scare people away. And I thought, well, this one may scare people, but all of us can relate to it. It's the day you missed in libraries, and all of it is on the final exam. So, anyway, so all the better titles I might have seen. All right, so before we get started, let me back up. Of course, this is an audience that is well versed in standards and likes standards and gets it. But let's just lay a little common ground. Why standards? Well, so we can share. And so we can reliably and safely get things done. So if you think about if our light bulbs didn't have the right standard size to fit into our lamps, it'd be a pretty dark room in a brief period of time here. And also if it's a floor lamp and then we try to plug it in, if it doesn't have the standard cord and it's not the standard electricity coming in, we're going to have issues, right? So pretty straightforward. And shoe sizes. Thank God standard shoe sizes exist. It's tough enough when I go clothes shopping. It makes me nuts. I go from ecstatic to near suicidal in the same shopping event. Oh, size 12 fit. Uh-oh, I need size 26. But fortunately, shoes, 7.5 is a 7.5, no matter who the manufacturer seems to be. And then a little more serious, what if rail or track gauges weren't standardized in North America? And worst case, we have derailment and serious injury and death. Best case, every time we get to a new owner of the next line, we're offloading all of the cargo and the people and loading them onto the next one, right? So clearly standards play a significant role. So what's true in non-information centric environments like those certainly is true in our information centric environment. And it really ultimately is about interoperability. And more specifically for this evening, what we're going to talk about is the consistency and predictability within and across information retrieval systems. That's the role that controlled vocabularies play. Right? It's all about enabling efficient and effective retrieval of information. So I just put my professor hat on briefly and ask us to think back and put it into a more theoretical perspective about information retrieval systems, which we work with in one form or another absolutely every day. And actually everybody interacts with them one way or another every single day. So on the one side, you have the information need, to which we apply rules so that we can format and articulate it or describe it, and it ends up being the query statement. So that's on one side. On the other side, within the system, we have the information object. And it can literally be a physical object. It can be a book on the shelf. It can be a paragraph in an encyclopedia. It could be anything, right? So we have that, and we apply rules to format and describe that so that we end up with, in essence, a surrogate record, something that's representing that content. And it's that represented content and our articulated, documented query statement that the real meat of the information retrieval system uses. That's the matching engine. So and when the two come together and we get a useful result, the user goes off happy. Controlled vocabularies are a key component to describing the content, to representing the content. Z3919 is the ANSI NISO standard for monolingual thesauri, and it enables the consistency of the user experience and the reuse of those controlled vocabularies. So consistency for the user within an information retrieval system and across different information retrieval systems. In a library setting, you don't want the user to have to learn 20 different query languages and stand on their head and spit nickels in this system and hope they get some kind of result. It should be learn it once, apply it across all of our resources. It's true in a corporate setting, in a less traditional library setting, in knowledge management setting, right? It's the same because of running queries against different knowledge bases, and it ought to be a consistent, predictable experience. The reuse of controlled vocabularies is important, at least for a number of reasons, not the least of which is it's a lot of work to build these and maintain them. And you don't want to have to rebuild completely from scratch every time you have a new information retrieval challenge to solve. And the more you standardize and adhere to the Z3919 standard, the more likely you're going to be able to reuse it. It also helps our colleagues on the information technology side when they're designing their systems, because they can understand what the behavior is going to be. How is it going to need to operate to consume those terms and the semantic relationships and travel across it. All right, so that's the mom and apple pie and the American flags part. And then there's the real world, right? It's messy. It may not be as messy as my grandson's bedroom, but it's messy. You know, in the real world, we work in organizations that are trying to achieve very specific and sometimes odd objectives. And we don't always have the time or the resources to be purists. So we all know that here's the proper way to structure this, whatever part of the information architecture we're working on. And then there's your boss breathing down your neck saying, you're in the way, hurry up. And you start to have to make compromises, because if it's a for-profit, they got to make profit. And you have to make intelligent compromises. And that's a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, or at least get you thinking about. The other part of the life is messy is we don't have ideal systems. For the most part, we inherit something that's either already been built, so something that's legacy, or something the developers, the coders are so far down the path that you can't change the train, forget it. So they may not literally run with scissors, but it often feels that way. That, not the developers, although they might. But it's more about those uncooperative IT systems that we work with. They just don't always work very well with us. The fact of the matter is that it's typically easier, if not absolutely always easier, for us to modify the controlled vocabulary than it is to bring the IT systems to heel and get them to stop running with scissors. So, it's about making calculated compromises. Right? You have to compromise to get the work done. Doing anytime you violate the standard, so it sounds so violent, but anytime you compromise the standard, you're going to introduce risks. The trick is to understand the standard well enough to recognize what those risks are, and then take action to mitigate or even avoid the risk completely. All right? The best practice I can tell you is to compromise the standards in as consistent a manner as possible, right? Because you're beginning to reintroduce predictability again. But you'll see in many cases, it's just, it's a mess. So I thought what we could do is I'd go through 3 case studies for things I've lived and breathed. And then I thought we'd probably have, especially since we started about 10 minutes early, 5-10 minutes early, we'll have a lot of time for Q&A. And as I said, I reserve the right to say, well, it depends. But I certainly don't know all the answers. Right?
So I have a question before you.
Absolutely.
On your previous slide, you mentioned compromising in a consistent manner. Can you give us an example of?
We'll see some.
Oh, great.
I think we'll see some.
Because I'm trying to think it through and I haven't gotten there yet.
Well, so off the top of my head, it depends.
Hey,
So-
you can use it.
One example would be if you're going to alter the true definition of a hierarchical relationship, and make sure that within either that facet or that taxonomy, depending upon how you're structuring it, it's logically consistent.
Oh,
All right? But if you mix it up, and some of my colleagues from Cengage can appreciate some of the work we're trying to go through, and we call it polishing, but and we'll get to it as one of our case studies. We've got a few course or discipline taxonomies that a primary issue right now is that hierarchical structure is jumbled. We need to settle on one and clean it up so it's predictable that way.
great, thank you.
Okay? All right, so the first one is about enabling knowledge discovery. So the company is a very large multinational professional services firm, so think accountants and consultants and tax professionals. Well over 100,000 employees scattered throughout the globe, 5 distinct business units, some in competition with each other for the work. And those business units have a set of offerings that would be global, and then they're also localized to a specific, so if it's South Africa, take tax as the global business unit, tax offerings in South Africa clearly are going to be different than in the United States or the UK. So, and it's privately held with partners who feel they own the universe, and think law firm, right? So lots of egos and lots of this is my company, which it is. So the business need that we were tasked with as the Global Knowledge Management Group was to enable rapid knowledge discovery and then also support effective reuse of content. Time is money in this environment, as you would imagine. The billing rates were anywhere and still are anywhere from $280 to $650 an hour. You don't want those people, even the junior staff, looking for content. You want to practically hand it to them as they fly by your office door sort of thing. It's a direct impact on revenue and productivity. So the challenge was to support browse navigation and search within a single repository, but also across repositories. A single repository is relatively easy, right? It's a contained system, but the fact of the matter is none of the practitioners stayed that sort of narrow focus. They worked across offerings within a business unit like tax, but then they also worked outside of their normal offerings, supporting and even driving the emergence of new service offerings. So they needed to be able to search across. So I was the knowledge manager there with a library background, and I went, this is not rocket science. I'm going to come out like a star. Oops. So we start out, right? You do the user analysis, understand, have a sense of the content base. Haven't done the drill down, real intensive audit yet, but we have a sense of the nature and the depth and breadth of the content, the different domains of knowledge covered. Now it's about what are the users, what's the user behavior. The great part, and this is the part where I started to get, this is going to be no challenge here. It's very simple. They went by content type, by business unit and the offering, by client or prospect, or industry, depending upon how specific they needed the content, geographic, and business issue. And I thought, all right, this is simple. So content type is a proposal, right? So the company wants to respond to a call for bids on something, so content type is proposal. That was pretty easy. Business unit and offering, those are, even though they change constantly because those partners own the universe and feel they spin it however they want, and don't care that they mess up all the accounting and knowledge management repositories, but still fairly straightforward. Consulting as a business unit, strategy and ops as the service offering, and then often a sub-service, a more specific, in this case, service operations. Very straightforward. 3-tier, not a problem. Client or prospect, I'm not one to reinvent the wheel. We have a CRM system. We'll just pull that data for client name. So is it General Motors or is it GM? I don't care, it's whatever they tell me it is, right? So pull it in. Very simple. Industry, again, I'm not going to reinvent the wheel. I'm going to use names. And even encourage people to stop thinking about SIC codes. And then geography, equally easy. Here's a standard for this. We'll use the ISO 3166. Slam dunk. Business issues, oh come on, that's just a subject vocabulary. That's even easier and more fun. Oops. Not so easy, and to say the least, that's when the wheels came off the car. And several years later, we had it figured out. But let me explain more about why it wasn't easy. The bottom, the Cliff Notes version is business issue is not the same as a business topic or subject, at least not in this environment. So a business issue in this environment is inferred and or explicitly stated in the content, but as an aggregate. You have to, it's not a quick subject analysis or conceptual analysis. You really had to know the domain and read through the content and understand what they were trying to achieve. These guys did it, and women did it that was their life. They went to management school, MBA, business school. So they'd say optimization of load. Well, that's, besides being prepositional phrase and making me twitch, I can't use that as a term. It's too ambiguous. Right? So I'm looking at that. Actually, I'm not alone. I mean, the team's looking at this going, All right, so what are the actual concepts that are buried in that? And it was easy to see logistics, cost control, revenue realization, supply chain management at a minimum. Well, there was no way the business was going to agree to asking their billable employees, and that's who was going to be doing any of this indexing or tagging. There's no way they were going to ask them to figure out 4 or more concepts per business issue. It just wasn't going to happen. And even if they did, I mean, who knows what kind of mess it would have made anyway. There's other parts to that. So what are you optimizing? You're optimizing the load. Yeah, but from what perspective? Is it weight and volume, so that you're maximizing the use of the container? Or are you trying to maximize the value, the dollar value? I mean, if I put 3 diamonds on the rail car, that might be maximizing the load, because again, a lot of return on investment for that going to New York versus a load of timber. So lots of concepts buried in that single string. So we couldn't just use business issue. It's too ambiguous. So the solution was, it still makes me twitch, was to tag or index the content. Again, remember, it's the practitioners doing this tagging, submitting their content into the repository as a mandatory part of finishing out either a successful or unsuccessful proposal bid, right, or completing a project, all these project documentation. So they were going to, and they do, tag the content based on the business unit and service offering of potential interest for future users. So it's not only the literal which business unit did it and what service offering. It was a request to ask these non-information science professionals to project who else might benefit from seeing this content when trying to solve a problem. Talk about risk, right? Scatter, false drops, all the things we're familiar with. But in essence, I'll put my professor hat back on and remind everybody, it's probably not near and dear on a daily basis to anybody but me in the room, because I still teach this, but this is user-centric indexing. And don't confuse user-centric with user-friendly. I mean, the whole point of any indexing is to enable users to find things. But user-centric indexing is certainly not a best practice. And what it's doing is asking or expecting the indexer to predict how this content might be relevant to a future unknown query. Talk about scatter. If the person doing it, we did try in-house actually, in all honesty. We tried having the knowledge managers do the indexing. Most of them didn't have an MBA. Most of them, I told you, I was the only librarian there that don't have the information science. They didn't. Handful of folks did have domain knowledge because they had been in the field practitioners. So they did all right because they had the domain knowledge. But the vast majority of our knowledge management folks were neither, they didn't have the capability. So we put it back on the practitioners, and it's just introducing the issue that's always a major issue around indexer consistency. What Jeannie predicts that this content might be useful for is almost guaranteed not going to be what I predicted to be useful for. And the frustrating part is, in theory, that would work if they had had the money to employ the right professionals to do it. Because it really would have worked. Some of the issues we had with just knowledge discovery in general was, especially the younger consultants who were being, you can imagine, think law firm, burn them out, toss them aside, those who survive get to be a partner. those poor folks, if they had had a quicker way to recognize that load optimization solved in trans-US trucking is conceptually almost the same problem of airline shipping, they could have gotten that much more existing experience, knowledge pushed to them or pulled. So in theory, if money was no object, it could have worked. Money is an object because the owners want it in their pocket, which is fair. So the mitigation that we put in place, right, we can anticipate what the issues are, because we know the standards well enough, we know that we're breaking best practice with respect to indexing as well as the vocabulary structure. From the systems perspective, we made sure that the user trying to find the knowledge could apply and remove filters, right? So they could, a number of perspectives, not just geography, but more importantly, from the business unit and service offering. So they could add some of those in or get rid of them based on their level of knowledge or what a jumbled mess or not that they received as a result set. And we also ensured that we were using Verity as the search engine. We ensured that a simple configuration, but we made sure that they could also run full text query against their search results. Right? And then from a people side, we educated, and provided a tremendous amount of support in terms of setting up an excellent, really was excellent, in essence, a knowledge help desk. The people would call in, they'd get support. And we'd go find the people, staff in the help desk would go find the documentation. So that was one. Any questions about that one before? I mean, we can come back, obviously, but I don't want to just be the talking head at you.
How big was your team on that?
Well, it depends.
It varied.
Yeah, it varied because just like the rest of the firm, it's very matrixed. So direct staff in the global KM portion is very small. And we each had our own areas, 4 or 5 people. But then each of the member firms, which meant country-based legal entities, the larger ones, so US, UK, South Africa, a couple of others, but those were the large firms, had their own KM teams, and that we worked and played somewhat together, well together. And then also the business units had their own KM organizations as well, so it's very, but this was a solution that worked well across the board. So the answer is it really depends. I mean, certainly no more than 120 people globally involved. So this one's very different. This one's about finding the best answer. And it's really about manipulating the user experience. And when I started working for this software company, I went, oh, tricking people. It's not just for e-retail anymore. However, what this company did, and it's since been bought by Oracle, is very, very effective in a very specific environment. So it's I think, a great example of breaking some of the rules and getting extremely valuable results. So privately held knowledge management software and services company, barely 200 people. But more importantly, it was the client. So it's the client business need that we were addressing. They ranged insurance, investment firms, retail products, pharmaceuticals, telecom, anywhere you can envision a call center. And just looking across those industries, you can anticipate that call center at a pharmaceutical company is a very different beast from a call center at telecom. Right? A whole different set of risks for the corporation, as well as speed of answer expectations and all this other stuff. But the bottom line across the board was, in every call center, it was rapid, precise retrieval of information to answer a very specific question. Which of these whys or business drivers, whichever one was more important, depended upon the industry, but it's fairly true across the board in terms of everybody employing the software. It's the knowledge base and search, which we'll look at in a minute, was around driving customer satisfaction. It was about creating opportunities for upsell and cross-sell. Who of us has not been on the phone irritated with our wireless provider, and they're busy trying to, instead of solve our problem, unfortunately, sell us a better data plan so we can spend more money and not understand the bill. And minimize risk of using inaccurate or inappropriate information. So certainly in insurance and pharmaceutical and investment firms, big high value for them. Litigation is not good. So the challenge that we consistently tried to solve for the client was to deliver accurate and effective answers to those very specific questions rapidly, like in seconds. So that generally it's from as soon as not in general, always, they answer the phone, the clock starts ticking, and depending upon the industry, they have 10 seconds to be off of that phone. So they get measured by length of time on the phone and first call resolution. So it avoids the and them not speaking. They're in a hurry. In terms of the analysis of end user behavior, one word. And sometimes, one word entry for the query that they're willing to put in. Sometimes if they're really good typists, which would leave me out, 3 words, a 3-word phrase, but almost always single word, an acronym, lingo common to the company. They are under significant pressure. I have been so much kinder to those poor people on the other end of the phone after having worked with them to install this software and build a KM program to help them not go through that stressful, horrible thing. Just amazing, the time they have to get out the answer. So the software solution is actually, I can frankly see why Oracle bought it. It's an inference engine. It's informed by industry-specific ontologies, which they really hated it when I pointed out that's a thesaurus. Oh, it's an ontology. It says so in our marketing. Yeah, it's a thesaurus. But really well built, so I gave the IT guys thumbs up for that, and fixed things when they weren't working. And it was always custom, so it was industry specific for the client, and then we would customize the language to represent the sometimes unique language of the client. Again, trying to support that poor, stressed out person answering the phone who just wants to put APG in and get the right content back out at them. It's really literally an answer. The installation process is really manipulating the results, but it's configuring the various components of the system, the information retrieval system, by playing around with the relevancy ranking, by adding in, for those of you with experience with machine-aided indexing, it's about identifying positive and negative evidence. So this inference engine can start to learn and also have a learning capability, does have a learning capability. And then we do the part that still leaves me going to a therapist because it was just such an awful thing, and yet extremely effective for what the business needed. And that was messing around with those hierarchical relationships, trying to stay consistent within any one ontology delivered as part of a solution to a specific client. But it was doing things as, for me, as absurd as putting trucks, motorcycles, and vans narrow to cars. And the whole point of that was, I'm not going to remember the client, but the whole point was, it was an insurance, doesn't matter who the client was, insurance client, and no matter how much they tried to get the call center folks to think of automotive insurance broadly, they're getting time. They're not typing automotive. They're going to type cars. Even I would do that. And so it was fudging around things like this. Clearly a non-standard hierarchical relationship. And also, this was another insurance one, non-standard associative relationships. So instead of accounting and accountant, so process and actor and things that you would expect, this was one of my favorite examples. We had to put skydiving as RT or associated with motorcycles. Any thoughts, knowing that it's an insurance company?
Risk here.
I'm sorry.
The risk of the
High-risk activities.
Person that is more likely to do one or the other.
Yeah. Yeah. So policies and claims associated with one are likely, obviously they're not going to be identical, but good starting points, because it's all about high-risk behavior that puts them into more expensive bucket for life insurance. So again, highly tuned to meet the specific needs. Absolutely zero intention to reuse these fudged vocabularies anywhere else, but excellent, excellent products for the call centers. So as I said, the risk is the lack of predictability. And the issue became, and we're toddling along. The company was 10 years old when I came in, and they hired a couple of us to be these knowledge management to help pre-sales and then help with the implementation. So we got to, I finally decided I really wasn't tricking them into anything because as a salesperson, because it really was a very useful solution. And then we helped them design the solution, implement it, and do the change management. So before we got there were three of us, before we got there, the company didn't realize that 4 to 6 months down the road, their customers were starting, their install base was starting to have significant issues. But we were there often long enough to start to see those issues, and the issue was, this is something highly configured for the majority question. And so as soon as you start to get something unusual or just very rare, so new trends emerging, so they couldn't get to the answers. So the result is expense to the company because they're kicking it to second tier or third tier support, when in fact it's probably a very easy answer. So what we did to mitigate that was really it turned out to be simple, just added browse navigation, that we would work with the client to define what their top categories wanted to be, and then mapped, very easy mapping exercise, crosswalk, mapped the fudged terms to where they would expect the content to show up. And that solved the problem. So part of that was we knew what we were breaking. And so when they came back, when we were sitting there, I think one of us noticed it before they really did what the real issue was. It wasn't that their content was bad. I mean, their immediate reaction was they didn't have sufficient content, or that it wasn't architected correctly. So any questions about that?
Oracle doesn't seem to have taken this to task. From
Well,
my
by their
experience
knowledge
of Oracle.
by their knowledge management solution. Now, if we could just get the rest of Oracle to implement for themselves, yes. there does seem to be a disconnect on many ways, but yeah. Having been an Oracle employee for a little while, because it, we still have really good HR systems. Can we implement them? I'm sorry.
How did you come up with, or who came up with, or did the system come up with such non-standard relationships?
Guilty. I looked at what the business needed to achieve, right? So I was looking at who the users were, what the tasks were, and what the constraints were for them to achieve that task. And the fact that we weren't even remotely expecting to reuse this sort of vocabulary anywhere else. So it wasn't, and it was no federated, there was no federated, so it wouldn't matter that it was that odd. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So some of it is about the associative relation, well, it all depended on the configuration. The associative relationships in general weren't shown in the direct results box. They were shown on the left-hand side, usually with right-hand side, usually with right-hand side, usually with some sort of flag to say, be sure to look here as well. Here are your, in theory, direct answers.
The other piece, I guess, that I was asking is, why would somebody come up with any reason to relate more? I mean, I understand the underlying reason for the relationship. What would make you think of putting a relationship between skydiving and motorcycles?
Because the answers they were seeking were essentially the same answer. So the correct answer for one is very close to the correct answer for the other, if not the correct answer. Make sense?
Can you give an example of an unusual question that it didn't come up with any results, and then what exactly was changed to make it work?
So a better example than the insurance would be a couple of the technology companies we worked with. This one you can probably relate to and anticipate. Release a new iPhone or a new chunk of software. And the bugs in the equipment or the software and their identification troubleshooting of them, that doesn't exist yet, or it's just beginning to emerge. So when you get a call in from a really irritated person who just spent their $600 to get their new iPhone that is doing gosh knows what, you use the knowledge base, it's just not there because the system hasn't been configured yet to deliver it to you. Some of the early documentation from the software developers might be there, but they couldn't get to it because it's just configured to present the top 10 answers. But if you could browse your way to it, you could get to it while the other people were busy recognizing, yes, that's an emerging problem. We need to write a call center troubleshooting guide, which is configured in a very specific way, and get it published and configured so it shows in the top 10. Does that make sense? So it's...
so the answer was there, but
they couldn't get to it because the system is literally designed to only show the top 10.
I see. Okay.
And there are thousands of potential answers in there. So think of it as it's a mammoth, all of them are mammoth knowledge bases.
So they retrained them back on browse things.
Well, they didn't have browse initially. All they had was literally search, because we don't want them on the phone long. Search is the quickest. But one way to cut down on the reduced first call resolution and the escalation to second and third tier was to give them the ability, if they were willing to, and many were, to take a hit on the length of time in exchange for first call resolution, to browse their way to the answer. So they could go to most of them, the browse navigation is almost always product oriented. If that makes sense, yeah, that would be. So this last one is near and dear to me currently, and to some of my colleagues in this room, I think. Hopefully they won't throw anything at me if I represent something not quite right. So, it's a reference and textbook publishing company. It might be called Cengage, not sure. We have the single metadata group, metadata standards and services business, and we're trying to use shared systems, and we have across the two major business units, which frankly is Gale, reference and research, and the higher ed, mostly higher ed, so 2- and 4-year trade and professional business. We have limited resources to get it done. So, and our more current business need has been, how can we leverage the existing, actually some of us would say it's like since 2007 we've been discussing this, but how can we leverage the existing investments and capabilities around controlled vocabularies to support the digital learning products? Gale vocabularies are deep and rich and huge, and the company has invested decades of time and money into these. The learning side goes, table of contents, maybe an back book index, I don't know, that's good enough. And as you move into a digital environment, you'll know that's really not good enough at all. And we tried this, leveraging the existing resources and then trying to, in terms of the vocabularies, and then trying to one-off them a little bit, because we're trying to maximize competitive advantage at minimum cost. These vocabularies take lots of time and money to build. So the challenge was to extend that very large subject thesaurus that we've used for decades. It's very successful. Actually multiple, because we have multiple thesauri as well as name authority files, but we've used it for decades. Thousands of reference items, millions of periodical articles, etc. So we're trying to use that to understand how we might index a textbook. And we wanted to do this within the confines of adhering to Z3919, because as Margot will tell you, we have very, Margot is a keeper of our policies and procedures and adherence to standards, and does an excellent job of doing exactly what I'm talking about in terms of what are the risks introduced if you don't adhere or follow. And then she has, and others, but adjusted our internal editorial policies and standards for the thesauri to meet our business needs, document it in a way that if we're all run over by a bus, the next folks that come in can follow the same policies, procedures, and standards that we were. So, important part is document this stuff. So the problem here was go back to the basics of how do we build a controlled vocabulary. One, understand the content base that you're going to tag or index with it. Two, understand the users and what tasks they're going to try to do. We have a disconnect. Houston, we had a problem. The textbooks, and think about it, they have a very distinct pedagogical flow to them. We're going to teach you this, and then once you've mastered that, I can teach you this, I can teach you this, I can teach you this. Reference resources and research materials, they support something very different. Simple as fact-checking or knowledge exploration. So you can wander, right? So learning assets, as I said, they're presented in a very, at least initially, a very specific order. But, so their access point is page 1, right? Go from there, initially. So, but reference materials, they should have nearly endless access points because you're trying to enable people to do knowledge exploration. They should be able to come in at any point and go from there. So you can predict that a thesaurus that supports reference and research, where it's just not going to match up with academic textbook content. That is two different nature of the content bases and very different tasks being achieved. And we learned that. We've confirmed you cannot do that. So what we did was develop discipline-based thesauri that, well, I don't want to jump ahead, but we mapped them to our subject thesaurus terms where we could, because all along, as Jeannie said in her intro, one of the rich value add we're all trying to deliver by blending higher ed with Yale reference and research has been to enrich that learning environment by, so here's your pedagogical flow while you're learning chemistry, and oh, by the way, when you hit this concept, it's a digital environment, here comes some reference and research materials that if you're not just a C student getting by, but somebody who's off to medical school, you might want to look at and learn more, and then go wandering off to all the other reference and research materials that this opens the door for. So we've mapped the discipline taxonomy terms to the subject thesauri where it makes sense. And for the most part, we haven't fudged any of those. We've defined them as equivalents, and they are true equivalents. It's either literal term match, or so darn close, we're, by looking at our scope notes or lexicographer notes, we know it's the same concept. So true equivalents. As we built out these taxonomies, we really tried to minimize trips to the therapist by adhering to the Z3919 where we could. And the fact of the matter is we really couldn't. So, the standard doesn't preclude pre-coordination, but it probably wouldn't be happy with this one, chemistry, measurement, and calculation. But it's always taught as a unit, so there wasn't business value to create that as two terms. There just wasn't. Keeping in mind, we're a for-profit company, we try to do as much machine-aided indexing as we can. We also try, when we have to use freelancers or even our internal staff, try to make it as rapid as possible. Why assign two terms when you're always going to assign those two terms? So that's one example of the pre-coordination. The hierarchies, and here's the example I gave, started to give a little earlier about how we use non-standard hierarchical logic, but tried to make it consistent within a vocabulary, within one of these standalone discipline taxonomies. So the one that, and I'm responsible because I took care of the chemistry, so. The chemistry equations made broad to balancing chemical equations. Well, balancing chemical equations is absolutely not in accordance to the standard narrow to chemical equations. Products and reactants, they're certainly not NT to chemical equations. You could argue they're NT to chemical reactions, and because it's a whole part, but because of the learning unit, we've lumped them together. The opening of that unit seems to consistently be chemical equations, all about chemical equations, and then these concepts are almost always, if not always, presented with. And then use of equivalents for non-equivalent concepts. And of course, we've seen this, we've all experienced this to some extent in any e-retail site, where, oh, you bought, I don't know, you bought a bottle of water, you're going to want this diamond watch. Really? Okay. But in this case, I I wouldn't even argue these are near equivalents, but because of the content base and the manner in which we are using these vocabularies, they might as well be. We want the term to be present for the search engine to hit or for our indexers to find and then discover the preferred variant and use that. But balancing chemical equations is not the preferred variant in the real world for balanced chemical equations, right? That's like saying accounting is equivalent to an accountant, and they're just not. But again, for the business case, it makes sense. Now, so the risks, once again, it's about predictability by muddling, and it's not consistent discipline to discipline in terms of how we've fudged the relationships. It depends on that discipline in terms of, and the standard pedagogical flow for teaching it, how those things have been fudged. What we're working on, and it probably continue forever, is ensuring that within a single discipline is your consistency. There's the predictability within the discipline. All right, so we know we've undermined that usability because it's not predictable. And the lack of adherence to Z3919 means we can't reuse these in different settings. This is it. So the mitigation is, well, you know what? We never intended to use them in search. So it's okay. But we're certainly front of mind, no, because what we're using them for is to enable content or course builders, creators behind the scenes, hold the content based on how they think of the content in the pedagogical flow that they use, and then to put like assets together to run analytics. So it's just software running against that, assessing individual student performance as well as the aggregate for the class against specific learning modules or concepts. So it's not, we're not using it for search. We don't expect the student, what student sits down and runs truly a search? We have a different solution for the student that wants to find a section in the textbook. So that this vocabulary is not intended in any way to support, help me find that phrase that I thought I highlighted and Bobby Joe said was awesome and now I can't find it, right? So we have a different solution for that. The other point is what I already said. We don't expect to use these anywhere else. It looks like they're going to be successful in half of our business. The other half of the business already has awesome vocabularies that work super well. So it's okay that we can't use these in any other environment other than, in the case of the chemistry discipline taxonomy, in chemistry learning, for chemistry learning assets. So again, we knew what we were breaking. The team worked before I got here, when I was on the other side as a vendor, going, really? We're going to do that? Okay. It worked really hard to avoid that, but when it's all said and done, 5 years? 5 years of working on this, this is the solution. This is what has to be done. So just in terms of getting a wrap up before we do some more questions, I wanted to remind everybody, think about it if you're faced with these sorts of information architecture and which standard you're going to break where. In this case, think about it from the holistic system view, right? And very, very simple sketch for information retrieval system, but that's the core of what we're messing with when we don't build the controlled vocabularies according to the standard. We're undermining the interoperability and the reuse of those vocabularies. You can map out your system and clearly not the level of detail you need to really look at it in your specific environment, but you just add in what you need to get down to that level of granularity and begin to see what breaks because of it's not consistent, it's not predictable, whatever, it doesn't have the right, whatever. And then think about how you're going to mitigate when it breaks. Is it lots of end-user education? Is it some inexpensive changes to the system by adding filters like Deloitte did? Look for things like that so you can mitigate it. But the better you know the standard, in this case Z3915, the better you can recognize what is going to break. Not only within, why it's going to break within your system. If that makes sense. Tales from the Crypt. Oh, and actually, I did leave the title, Safety Tips from the Crypt.
We're going to bring it to life now.
Does every discipline have a uniform, consistent structure to the pedagogy?
I don't think so, not what I've seen so far. I mean, I think they should all do the way chemistry does. It's very logical. But no, I don't think so. And I would imagine, Denise would probably speak to her, Patricia better, I would imagine some of the less quantitative disciplines have a lot more of a circular, intentionally so. We're going to introduce this concept and we're going to let it sit in your head for a while, and then later in the term or next semester, we're going to come back and bring it to another level. So I think that's probably true. Any question? I mean, does actually is anybody working on this level of thesaurus development or taxonomy work at this point? Probably not.
Just at a much, much lower level. The Federal Reserve System has a database that's called FedPrint that San Francisco manages, and we are struggling with, should we have control vocabularies or taxonomy? And then there's something that economists use called the JEL codes. And the librarians, for some reason, just shy away from assigning JEL codes. It's equivalent to what you were saying about you need an MBA to understand the business issues.
Yeah.
So they need to have the economists or economists trained in order to understand the issues, because it doesn't come out in the title or the abstracts.
Right.
You have to be able to decipher what's in the paper.
Yeah.
So we're struggling with, should we just throw away trying to put controlled vocabulary in there and just let people free text search? And there's one system that's out there that that's exactly what they do. They do not require any kind of controlled vocabulary or taxonomy. And the librarians from our discipline come in with a whole different approach. So I can see, hopefully we are on different gauges of rail, because otherwise we are going to have a crash.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. But it's certainly, it's all about the business case, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, is figuring out, is free text search, full text search sufficient
Right.
or not?
It's
Yeah.
a dilemma. Yeah.
It is, and there is no, it doesn't matter if you didn't miss any day in library school.
Right.
Because it's the real world, and it's messy, and it's the sort of, I think it's awesome challenges that we get to grapple with, but.
Yeah, and what's
Figuring it
really
out.
nice is that this database has been around for, probably 10 to 15 years. And apparently about every 3 to 4 years, it goes through an angst. And various groups want to reevaluate it so that we're at that point again. And I think it's a great discussion because it keeps it alive and active and growing.
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's somewhat what you expected. I always get frustrated when I read a session description and I show up, really? I knew I should have done true confessions.
Could you talk a little bit about connecting inferencing systems to this kind of thing so you can start to experts just think about the meeting.
Yeah. And Christine will be able to build off this very nicely, so that's a good, Christine and I worked together at Dow Jones, so I tried to absorb some of her brain cells and knowledge, but didn't always succeed. But what's great, the ontologies are simply thesauri, but the IT people or the computer scientists are going, no! Think of an ontology, base one. Think of an ontology as a rogue thesaurus, one that is no longer compliant in a controlled fashion with Z3919. So entities, right, if you think about entities can have multiple types of relationships, okay? So we can define it very differently. Inference engines consume that as their guidepost to the knowledge that's contained ultimately within whatever knowledge base or content base that's being queried or enabled. You know, the discovery is not always query. It could be very complex navigation being supported. If you think of topic maps, they take advantage of somewhere in between rogue thesauri and rigorous Z3919, so that you can really get in there and do that knowledge discovery that we used to be able to do when you walked into a physical library. And I really age myself here, but look in the card catalog, not the OPAC, but the card catalog, and find the call number and physically go to the stacks and discover as you're browsing and scanning and taking things off the shelf and, oh, smells good, it's not quite right, and you end up X shelves over and down for the right thing. Right? Digital environment, you either go there precisely these days still, or you got dumb luck or you got nothing, right, in terms of finding that resource. So the inference engines begin to be able to use the ontology to understand the map of the knowledge domain and make the connections that we don't have to literally establish. You can follow those semantic web and begin literally to infer relationships that just will never, machine-aided indexing isn't going to do it, and we'll never have the money, the skills, or we'll have the skills, but the money and the resources to make the controlled vocabularies to manually index it all. And it's that kind of system that gives us the flexibility to really reinvent in the digital space, a virtual space, that knowledge exploration. And Christine, really, just don't let her start doing XML and RDFA. Friend of a friend, and just make it work. So, did that help? Or go the direction you wanted?
Well, thank you so much. If there are no other questions.